So I'll be presenting on psychopaths and religion, which a lot of people always associate with the negative. Yeah, there's a lot of them that affect how we perceive everything. So I'll start off the paper. The day of November 16, 1957, changed the very social fabric of rural America. In the quiet town of Plainfield, Wisconsin, deer hunting season had started on that Saturday morning. But what changed the annals of America was another crime, so horrifying to our minds that we have subjected the criminal and the murder to fiction and traded facts for an American mythos. But we had help, as in most things, to distort the truth and run to rumor, then straight into fiction. So everybody? All right. The fact that the murderer never spent any formal sentence in jail for his crimes, but instead spent the rest of his days in a mental institution, not too far from his home, only helped to strain the precarious truth and monger fear. Society subjected the criminal to his own crimes and dehumanized his actions to such a degree that what was left of the man is lost, and like his victims becomes a body of ideology to feed on. We cannibalize him ritually with social mediums and philosophy to sanitize our own subconscious. That Saturday morning, Edward Theodore Gein got ready early in the morning and entered Mrs. Warden's hardware store to buy a jar of antifreeze. She wrote his purchase on her slips for that day, and he came in to ask about a gun. Shot her in the head. From 8 p.m. until Mrs. Warden's head was found at around 4:30 to 4:45 a.m., the searching officers at the Gein farm discovered what was then described as the House of Horrors. The notorious woman suit, a box of genitalia, female. The face masks made out of real faces. Skulls on the bedstand, sawed-off skull caps, organs and entrails in a box, and so forth. So began the Midwest story of the Boogeyman. Upon arrest, Gein was subjected to third-degree interrogation tactics that resulted in his original confession, days to months later, to be suppressed for many years. It is to be stated that although one of the investigating officers, Officer Schley, had died of a heart attack less than a year prior to the second trial of Gein in 1968, it is thought, among his friends and families, that the pressure of testifying at Gein's second trial and reliving the trauma that the investigation caused him resulted in his hastened death. The original confession was some 700 pages long and is still only used in chunks and sections to speculate. It was suppressed because of the tactics, which resulted in Gein being slammed up against the wall, and the judge's sentiment that such means were the worst kind in obtaining a confession if the officer's own men had to pull him off. It is important to note that in 1958, Wisconsin followed the Old English rule gathered from the McNaughton case, which posed the question of whether the defendant was capable of distinguishing right from wrong. Two leading psychiatrists, Dr. Schubert and Dr. Miller, gave testimony to Gein's legal insanity, while the district attorney tried to show Gein's legal sanity in his cross-examination. Honig offered to produce 4 witnesses to show the normalcy of Gein's conduct with others, but withdrew his offer. The state then called Dr. Edward M. Burns, another psychiatrist from Central State, who testified that Gein was medically insane but legally sane. Also to be noted is that as soon as some of the findings came out in the media, neighbors and townfolk who were familiar with Gein complained about stomach aches from the meat they had received from him that he called venison, but he didn't hunt deer. The meat was, so far as documented, untested, and the claims, so far as documented, unchecked. The following years, until his death in 1984, were marked with confessions, asylums, newspapers, trials for conviction, probation, psychiatric care, documentary makers, horror movies, comics, humor, speculation, and much more. It seemed every time he made the news or his case was up for review, his story became a little more obscured by the media and sensationalized at the time by the news. We failed to realize he was not the sophisticated murderer early on when approaching his case. He wasn't even a serial murderer by definition. He was a serial grave robber who committed 2 murders. We don't put into context much of what we do know, because then we would have to dig a little deeper into ourselves to understand how truly simple his actions and case are. We muddled the truth with speculation to understand why. We threw in opinions to make sense without study. We assumed we were smarter by applying science, only to never get a formal conviction in the traditional penal system. We used humor to wage against our sympathy. We burned down his home and the evidence against him to burn away his actions from memory. There was no physical proof. Did it make the deed less real and perpetuate this idea of a monstrosity sitting in our backyards? Or was it really the best way to dispose of a blemish on American society? By obscuring him in psychiatry behind the tarnished hospital windows. If we obscured and denied the simplicity of answers to the existential questions concerning life's meanings in regards to Gein, moral obligation, guilt, injustice, finitude, and what endures, did we construct something that was less than human? What we constructed was something that was out of our control and our ability to contain, so it became something to fear. We take, for instance, 3 classic and iconic films of murder and psychiatric development to study how this one man helped influence 3 of the more iconic cinematic figures of 3 distinct eras. The first of the iconic list would have to be Psycho, which was a novel first published in 1959 by Robert Bloch. Bloch was living in Wisconsin in 1957, but based the story on the circumstances of the Gein case, rather than the case itself. He was surprised to find years later that his story reflected Gein's case almost to a tailored verbatim of what transpired and what was being speculated on. Bloch based the plot of the novel on the notion that the man next door may be a monster, unsuspected, in the gossip-ridden small-time life, instead of the actual case. So, once the story was circulated and the movie was adapted, few changes were implemented by Hitchcock. except to meet the censorship standards of American cinema during the 1960s. The psychology of the film was based in the sentiment of sympathy to the central character of Norman Bates, who we learned literally drives himself insane by killing off his mother, Norma, when he finds her having an affair with her lover who has replaced him, much to his disillusionment after being subjected to her temper in psychologically abusive ways for the majority of his life up until her demise. Much of the central theme is based on the mythology of matricide, which was a crime throughout ancient Greece before patriarchy replaced matriarchy, hinting that the killing of a mother figure was more grave than a father figure because the ancient religions were based on female representatives rather than male. Once patriarchy became the norm, the concepts of matriarchy and religion were delegated to cult followings because they were harder to suppress. Even the birth of goddesses were changed from pagan or barbarian ideas, as Montague in the 16th century stated of barbarism. Each man calls barbarism whatever is not his own practice, to conform to the social order of male hierarchy, as is the case in the myth of Orestes. Hence the notions of psychological trauma resulting in the mother being murdered by the son, an act of sacrificing love and ensuing madness at the loss of a much greater love. Why do we essentially sympathize with Norman Bates? We sympathize with him because of his tragic beginnings and downfall. Like many characters in Greek myths, he grows up abused by a number of uncontrollable forces, abandoned, and a seemingly perfect profile for the declination in moral and societal standards. He is, in essence, a Greek myth made all-American by the social makeup in the aftermath of reformatory and institutional structural decline. We sympathize with his psychologically troubled predecessors because for years upon years they had been our relatives, our friends, our community members. And we saw no more reason to get rid of them other than the social burden they placed on us for one reason or another. Only later to find that the very institutions we trusted them to were often far worse than even the most harrowing tales of neglect we could imagine. With the age of asylum and reformation came the age of social adjustment to the new threat released on society. We had entrusted them for so long to the medical profession that we were shocked into accepting them back into our homes. After a series of telling journalism accounts disclosed that most institutions were understaffed, nursed by the criminal patients, are often subject to a professional's need for medical recognition and advancement. But later we harbor a tall tale of resentment because of the strain they put on us during the times of economic fallout. So why didn't we sympathize with Dean? He was a well-known member of the community. He was always helping the neighbors or caring for the children. He was dubbed a simple and effeminate man, but not a complete and utter recluse. While Norman is cut off and blockaded in his separation. In Norman's case, a young, isolated person with no one left is someone to feel sorry for. In Gein's case, an old person who has no one left but isn't isolated from the community is someone who can change his own life. The beauty of hypocrisy had come to rural America's backyard, and the illusion of the wholesome community was shattered by a man with the IQ of 99. People of Wisconsin didn't hate him because of his crimes alone. They hated him because his crimes brought the outside world into their homes. Was his mother too fanatical in her faith? Undoubtedly, yes. But a good moral citizen at the time was always wholesome in faith to some degree, or he wasn't a popular community member. What is to be highly noted is the fact that because of those small town mentalities, many major crimes in rural communities went unchecked or unrecognized in the national attention because of the lack of police force. Much like the case of Joe Wall in 1937 of Texas, who killed and dismembered waitresses at his diner, fed them to alligators, and then killed himself when confronted by the police. We had also just come out of World War II with Germany. Geen was a man of Germanic descent, operating in our backyards for some 12 years, unnoticed. With the Cold War coming at us full force, the societal implication is only compounded by religious and scientific views of the time. The shock value through media had to surpass many things we had heard about in our war against Europe, or we could have been dubbed unpatriotic or communist. In the following generation, we have the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. Thomas Hewitt, or Leatherface, was a cannibal serial killer in a rundown city of Texas, expanding on the plot of the killer unknown in our backyard. We see a more bleak animal instinct in this character rather than a person. The only real resemblance of Geen in this 1970s horror movie were subtleties like the face masks and his childlike dance in the dawn light and the suspended female corpse. The length of Leatherface's reign is somewhat in the field of Geen, albeit much shorter as the character expanded in ensuing generations. Yet even this bleak animal-like approach, we box ourselves within society's need to class and define. Leatherface is a man running on pure fear of being outcasted by the only people who have ever shown him any form of love. A classic image of rejection because of his difference. His nature is manipulated by suggestion and forms of abandonment that damage his psychological development. Negative reinforcement of society's norms cause resentment to fester within him, much like the social climate of the political scandal with Nixon, the Kent State shootings, and the Munich Olympic massacre. But he is so iconic in cinema because he was the first character without a much-needed frame of reference to compare him to, except for the madmen of myths, our prejudices, and our fears. But by then we had reinforced this cultural ritual therapy of consumption via media. It isn't until almost 30 years later that we learn of his origins, background, and psychological makeup. From a plump mother who dies giving birth to him inside the same factory he later works in, to being thrown into a dumpster and rescued by a scavenger who looks past his defects to raise him. It screams of the classics, smudged with sentiments of the war and the findings of major sciences. What really galled the horror sentiment was that it played on public emotion by being the first movie to claim it was based on true events. With so many factors influencing our opinions in the 1970s, how are we supposed to pull fact from fiction? Artistically, it rivaled all other horror films with its home movie feel and in-depth cues of nightmares come true. But in 1974, that's all it was. A play on our fears that to this day we cannot escape. Next to come was The Silence of the Lambs. Almost everything about this movie and its sequels takes a whole new direction. We have a serial cannibal murderer, a doctor of criminal psychology, who helps the FBI search for other serial murderers. What actually is the one thing that sets Hannibal Lecter apart? his sophistication. Here we had a character who played on the 1990s sentiment of self-importance, yet appealed to all because he was an intellectual. Did it matter that he was a cannibal? A negligible fact when you consider he knew what fava beans were and how to pair them with liver and Chianti. A man who was locked in almost airtight cells and still was needed by the FBI to solve a seemingly small town transsexual serial murderer case. So many factors play into this 1991 movie of the prejudices from that era. But a criminal with barely any background at the time was better than an unknown stalking small town folk. Buffalo Bill is a mashup of a few leading serial killers from the 1970s and so forth, by default being the only character without any redeeming qualities. Its basic makeup of all that these men portrayed to the public while on trial was the basis for Bill. But with an almost anti-villain villain who could give us an insight into the criminal mind, cinema needed something truly bizarre and macabre to pin on the Buffalo Bill character. Clearly, homophobic sentiment and prejudiced views were given light because of the black shadow cast by Gein, but compounded by sexual criminals from years prior and after. By 1991, sex crimes seemingly knew no bounds, and the animal next door really was just behind the next mailbox. Religion was yet up again in the air because all of the different movements seeking rights left in yonder from society. So why not create a character with all these prejudice qualities we mask nowadays? Didn't matter that he represented the very institutions that had forced lobotomies, sterilization, and was surmounted to medical torture on the psychologically inept to gain insight? Nope. Because he helped the hired safeguard of American government. Did Buffalo Bill warrant our sympathy? Not so much. He represented everything we unconsciously associate with the concept of a modern-day boogeyman, just like the Leatherface, Norman Bates, and Gein. The only difference in variation is that Gein was real and rumor-mongered into the unconscious mind at an early schoolyard age in the rural area with black comedy. Norman Bates was humanized in all accounts at the very end, giving us only vague suggestion in the movies and showing us that forgiveness was fundamental in understanding. Leatherface was the sum of all fears, bleak and desolate in comparison to modern society on a social front among peers. He was the id to our social Freud ego, while Lecter was the form of gray in society, and Buffalo Bill was the rudimentary approximation of what the 30 plus years after Gein had inspired. He was the fodder to further the concept of intellect over basic social and religious constraints.